My name is Stella Carter, and I'm 38 years old. 3 weeks ago, I walked into my younger brother's wedding reception in downtown Millbrook Harbor, wearing my best navy dress and a smile I'd practiced in the mirror for an hour. What I didn't expect was to become the punchline of the night, mocked, humiliated, and dismissed in front of 200 guests by people who were supposed to love me. But what they really didn't expect was what happened when the best man stood up, looked directly at me, and declared in a voice that commanded the entire room, "Admiral on deck." You see, they thought they knew my story, my family, my brother Dylan's new wife Cassandra Thornfield, even the wedding guests who'd whispered behind champagne glasses about poor Stella, the sister who'd been drifting through life, working dead-end jobs, never quite measuring up to everyone's expectations. They saw someone they could safely ignore, someone whose feelings didn't matter enough to consider before crafting their cruel jokes. For the past 5 years, my family had written me off as the disappointment. While my brother Dylan climbed the corporate ladder at Meridian Financial, while he bought his downtown penthouse and planned his picture-perfect wedding to Cassandra Thornfield, daughter of Millbrook Harbor's most prominent real estate dynasty, I'd been working as a night shift supervisor at the Ocean View shipping terminal. Not glamorous, not impressive, just steady work that paid my bills and kept me invisible. They didn't know that every night for the past 8 years, I'd been living a completely different life. They didn't know about the classified missions in the South China Sea, the diplomatic negotiations I had led in hostile waters, or the commendations locked away in a safe deposit box downtown. They certainly didn't know that the shipping terminal supervisor cover story I'd maintained was carefully crafted by the Department of Naval Intelligence to protect active operations I was still running. My family saw what I needed them to see. A woman in her late 30s who'd never quite found her path, who lived alone in a modest apartment on Harbor Street, who drove a 7-year-old Honda and shopped at discount stores. They saw someone safe to pity, safe to exclude from important conversations, safe to mock when they needed to feel superior. The wedding invitation had arrived addressed to Stella Carter plus guest. A reluctant afterthought, I was sure. The seating chart placed me at table 12, wedged between Dylan's college roommate's elderly aunt and a +1 nobody knew. Far enough from the family tables to be forgotten, close enough to the kitchen doors to catch every clatter and crash from the catering staff. But I'd gone anyway, hoping that maybe Dylan's wedding would be different. Maybe this would be the moment our family remembered how to include me, how to treat me like I belonged somewhere in their perfect picture. I'd even bought him a generous gift. A vintage compass set I'd found at an antique shop in Harbor Heights, engraved with coordinates that held special meaning from our childhood summers at our grandfather's lake house. I should have known better. I should have recognized the signs when Cassandra's smile went sharp every time she looked at me during the rehearsal dinner. I should have paid attention to the way Dylan avoided eye contact, how he'd deflected every attempt I'd made to have a real conversation in the weeks leading up to the ceremony. Instead, I'd chosen hope. I'd chosen to believe that family meant something more than the neat categories they'd sorted me into. I'd chosen to show up with an open heart, ready to celebrate their happiness, even though mine had been deliberately overlooked for years. The reception at the Grandview Ballroom was everything you'd expect from a Thornfield wedding. Crystal chandeliers, ice sculptures, a string quartet playing softly while guests mingled with cocktails that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I'd found my assigned seat, made polite conversation with the aunt about her garden club, and waited for the inevitable moment when I'd become completely invisible again. But visibility, as I was about to learn, could be far worse than being ignored. When the best man, a tall, distinguished man in his 50s, whom I'd never met, rose to give his toast, I'd expected the usual jokes about Dylan's bachelor days, maybe an embarrassing story from college, the kind of harmless ribbing that makes everyone laugh and feel included in shared memories. What I got instead was a carefully orchestrated humiliation designed to put me in my place once and for all. What I got was a reminder that in their world, I would always be the family's biggest disappointment, the cautionary tale they told about what happens when you don't live up to potential. But what they really didn't expect was what happened when the best man stood up, looked directly at me, and declared in a voice that commanded the entire room, "Admiral on deck." Some stories start with an ending. This one starts with the moment I decided to stop hiding who I really was. The reception was in full swing when Cassandra's maid of honor, a razor-sharp brunette named Victoria Ashworth, clinked her champagne flute with surgical precision. The room quieted, conversations fading to expectant whispers as all eyes turned toward the head table where the wedding party sat like royalty surveying their kingdom.
"Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria began, her voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no in your entire life. "Before we hear from our wonderful best man, I'd like to share a few words about our beautiful bride and her new family." I should have known. The way she emphasized new family with just enough bite to draw blood, the way her gaze swept the room and landed on me for just a fraction too long. Victoria Ashworth hadn't gotten where she was, senior partner at Ashworth & Associates, Millbrook Harbor's most exclusive law firm, by being subtle with her cruelty. Cassandra has always had such a gift for bringing out the best in people. She sees potential where others see, well, where others might see limitations. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. My stomach began to tighten. And Dylan, sweet Dylan, has such a generous heart. He's always been the type to extend invitations even when others might question whether it's appropriate. After all, family gatherings can be so complicated when not everyone is quite operating at the same level. The whispers grew louder now. I could feel heads turning in my direction, curious glances from people trying to figure out who Victoria was talking about. My face began to burn, but it kept my expression neutral. Years of diplomatic training had taught me to maintain composure under fire. "But that's what makes the Thornfield-Carter union so beautiful," Victoria pressed on, warming to her theme. "Cassandra brings such elevation to the family dynamic, such refinement. It's wonderful to see someone willing to lift others up from wherever they might be struggling." Dylan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he didn't stop her. Cassandra's smile remained perfectly fixed, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture that looked supportive, but felt possessive. "So let's raise our glasses," Victoria said, lifting her champagne toward the ceiling, "to Cassandra and Dylan, and to the beautiful example they set of how love can bridge any gap, professional, social, or otherwise." The toast that followed felt hollow, mechanical. People drank because they were supposed to, but the energy in the room had shifted. I could feel the weight of curious stares, the whispered conversations behind hands and napkins. But Victoria wasn't finished. "Oh, and speaking of family," she added, as if the thought had just occurred to her, though I could see the calculation in her eyes, "I think we should all take a moment to appreciate Stella, Dylan's sister, for making such an effort to be here tonight." Every head in the ballroom turned toward me. The spotlight operator, clearly following some prearranged signal, actually illuminated table 12. I was trapped in a circle of light like a specimen under a microscope. "It really shows such dedication," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with false warmth, "when someone takes time away from their night shift supervisor duties to celebrate with the family. That kind of steadiness is so admirable. Not everyone needs to conquer the world, after all. Someone has to keep the ships moving in and out of the harbor, while others are busy with more demanding pursuits." The laughter that followed wasn't malicious, not exactly. It was worse than that. It was pitying, patronizing, the kind of gentle amusement reserved for children who think they're being helpful by washing dishes and end up breaking half of them. And I just love how Stella always brings such authentic, down-to-earth energy to these family events. It's so refreshing to have someone who can remind us all to stay humble, no matter how high we might rise in our careers or social circles. The applause that followed felt like nails on a chalkboard. Polite, obligatory, tinged with uncomfortable laughter. I sat perfectly still in my circle of light, hands folded in my lap, face carefully composed while my heart hammered against my ribs. Dylan finally looked at me then, across the sea of round tables and flickering candles. For just a moment, I saw something that might have been regret flicker across his face. But then Cassandra leaned over and whispered something in his ear, and his expression closed off again. The spotlight moved away, the conversations resumed, and I was left sitting in the relative darkness of table 12, invisible once again, except for the occasional glance and whispered comment. Victoria resumed her seat at the head table, looking supremely satisfied with herself. She'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do: put me in my place publicly, reminded everyone present of their proper position in the social hierarchy, and done it all with enough plausible deniability that anyone who complained would look oversensitive. What she didn't know was that I'd memorized every word she'd said, every pause, every inflection, every calculated cruelty. In my line of work, you learn to catalog threats with perfect accuracy. What none of them knew was that the best man, the distinguished stranger who'd been sitting quietly through Victoria's performance, had been watching me with the kind of intense focus that had nothing to do with social curiosity and everything to do with recognition. And what they were all about to discover is that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone assumes is harmless. But Victoria wasn't finished with me yet. As the servers began circulating with the main course, herb-crested salmon that probably cost more than I made in a week, she stood up again, this time with her phone in hand.
"You know what?" she announced, her voice carrying that particular brand of false enthusiasm that every woman recognizes as a warning signal. "I just realized we need to document this moment properly. Cassandra, Dylan, this is such a special night, and we want to make sure we capture all the important family memories." The professional photographer had been discreetly moving around the room all evening, but Victoria had something else in mind. She held up her phone, the camera app already open, and began moving around the tables like a social media influencer hunting for content. "Everyone smile," she called out, snapping photos of the head table, the wedding party, the prominent guests from Meridian Financial and Thornfield Real Estate. Each photo was accompanied by her running commentary, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. "Oh, this one's perfect for the company newsletter," she said, photographing Dylan with his colleagues. "And this one's definitely going on Cassandra's Instagram. Look how stunning you look, honey." She worked her way around the room with military precision, capturing what she deemed the important moments, the meaningful connections, the people worth preserving in the official record of this perfect evening. And then she reached table 12. "Stella!" Victoria exclaimed as if she just discovered me sitting there. "We can't forget family, can we? This is such a sweet table. You've got Dorothy here from the garden club, and James, who's visiting from Portland, and of course our hardworking harbor supervisor." The way she said harbor supervisor made it sound like I had been caught playing dress-up in someone else's clothes. Several people at nearby tables turned to look, drawn by Victoria's deliberately loud voice and the sudden focus on our forgotten corner of the reception. "Come on, Stella, give us a smile," Victoria cooed, holding up her phone. "I want to get a good shot for the family album, something that really captures the authentic charm you bring to these occasions." I looked up at her, this woman who'd spent the last 10 minutes systematically humiliating me under the guise of celebration, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too reactive. This was something more dangerous. "Actually," I said quietly, "I'd prefer not to be in photos right now." Victoria's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. She hadn't expected resistance.
Oh, come on, she pressed, leaning closer. Don't be camera shy. This is a family celebration. Everyone needs to be included. I said, no, thank you. The temperature at table 12 dropped 10 degrees. Dorothy from the garden club suddenly became very interested in her salmon. James from Portland found something fascinating about his wine glass. Victoria straightened up, her expression hardening. She'd been challenged publicly, and in her world, that simply didn't happen. Not by someone like me. You know what, Stella? She said, her voice taking on a sharp edge. I think I understand the problem here. You're feeling a little out of place, aren't you? A little overwhelmed by all the success and happiness around you. She gestured broadly at the elegant ballroom, the crystal and flowers, the designer gowns and tailored suits. It must be difficult watching your little brother achieve everything you haven't been able to. The successful career, the beautiful wife, the respect of the community. Conversations at nearby tables began to quiet. This was no longer playful teasing. This was something uglier, and everyone could feel the shift in the room's energy. You know what's really sad? Victoria added, apparently deciding that her previous attack hadn't been thorough enough, is that you're here alone tonight. I mean, at your age, watching your little brother get married to someone so accomplished, it must really highlight what's missing from your own life. She tilted her head with mock sympathy. But hey, maybe the shipping company offers good benefits. Health insurance, retirement planning. That's important when you don't have anyone else to depend on. The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. She had identified every vulnerability: my age, my single status, my perceived lack of achievement, my isolation from the family, and systematically shredded them in front of 200 witnesses. What Victoria didn't know was that I'd survived interrogations by hostile foreign agents. I'd sat across negotiating tables from people who'd perfected the art of psychological warfare. I'd been trained to endure pressure that would break most people. But this wasn't about endurance. This was about choice.
I could have stayed silent, let her finish her performance, and slipped out of the ballroom to lick my wounds in private. I could have given them exactly what they expected: the defeated older sister, too broken to fight back. Instead, I stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically. I rose from my chair with the same measured calm I'd used in countless high-stakes situations. I smoothed down my navy dress, adjusted my posture, and looked Victoria directly in the eye. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's smile wavered, uncertainty flickering across her face for the first time all evening. Because the thing about underestimating someone is that it only works until the moment they decide to show you exactly who they really are. The moment stretched between us like a taut wire. Victoria's perfectly applied makeup couldn't quite hide the uncertainty that had crept into her eyes. She expected me to crumble, to apologize, to slink away from her public dismantling like a wounded animal. What she hadn't expected was for me to stand my ground. "I asked if you were finished," I repeated, my voice carrying just enough steel to cut through the ambient noise of the reception. The conversations at nearby tables had stopped entirely now. Even the servers had paused in their duties, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. Victoria's laugh was sharp, brittle. "Oh, Stella, I wasn't trying to upset you. I was just being honest about..." "About what, exactly? About how you see me? About what you think my life is worth? About the assumptions you've made based on information you don't actually possess?" The ballroom felt like it was holding its breath. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. In Victoria's world, people like me were supposed to know our place, accept our position in the hierarchy, and gracefully endure whatever treatment the successful people deemed appropriate. "I think you're overreacting," Victoria said, but there was something defensive in her tone now. I was simply acknowledging that we all have different roles to play in life. There's nothing shameful about... Nothing shameful about what?
about working an honest job, about not meeting your standards for what constitutes success. I could feel the attention of the entire room focusing on our corner like a laser beam. Victoria's phone was still in her hand, but she'd lowered it now. The photo session had been forgotten as she realized she was no longer controlling this interaction. You want to talk about roles, Victoria? Let's talk about yours. The successful lawyer, the maid of honor, the woman who thinks her accomplishments give her the right to humiliate others at family celebrations. Is that the role you're comfortable playing tonight? A flush was creeping up Victoria's neck, standing her décolletage pink. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she categorized as harmless. Now wait just a minute, she started, but I held up a hand. No, you've had your turn to speak. You've had your moment to perform for the crowd, to make your points, to establish your superiority. Now I have a question for everyone listening. I turned slightly, addressing not just Victoria, but the broader audience that had been drawn into this confrontation. The wedding guests, the family members, the colleagues and friends who had witnessed my public humiliation and said nothing. How many of you have been in this situation? I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. How many of you have sat there while someone else decided your worth, defined your success, judged your choices without knowing the first thing about your actual life? I could see heads turning, people exchanging glances. This wasn't what anyone had expected from the evening's entertainment. Because here's what I want to know, I continued, looking directly at the faces around me. When someone stands in front of a room full of people and decides to tear another person down, systematically, deliberately, cruelly, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to sit there and take it? Are you supposed to smile and pretend it doesn't hurt because confronting it would be making a scene? Or maybe you're supposed to quietly excuse yourself, slip out the back door, go home and pretend it never happened so everyone else can continue enjoying their salmon and champagne without the awkwardness of having to acknowledge what just occurred. The silence in the room was profound now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped clattering dishes. I could see my brother at the head table, his face pale, his hands gripping his napkin like a lifeline. I'm genuinely curious, I said, looking around the room, because Victoria here seems to know exactly how this should go. She seems to believe that her success, her position, her connections give her the right to humiliate others who she deems beneath her notice, and everyone else seems willing to let her do it. I paused, letting that sink in. So I want to hear from you. Not tonight, not here, but I want you to think about it. I want you to go home tonight and ask yourself, what would you do? Would you stay silent and let someone destroy you piece by piece for the entertainment of others? Would you accept their version of who you are, what you're worth, what your life means? I could see phones being discreetly raised now, not for Victoria's social media documentation project, but because people sensed they were witnessing something significant, something that might matter beyond this evening.
Because here's the thing about being underestimated, I said, my voice dropping to almost a whisper, but somehow still carrying to every corner of the ballroom. It only works if you agree to play the role they've written for you. Victoria was staring at me now with something approaching alarm. The dynamic had shifted completely, and she was no longer the one in control of this narrative. Some of you know what it feels like to be dismissed, overlooked, categorized as less important because your achievements don't shine brightly enough for other people's standards. Some of you have sat in rooms where your worth was being debated by people who never bothered to learn your story. I looked directly at the camera phone that was most obviously recording this moment. And some of you have watched it happen to others and said nothing because it was easier, because it wasn't your fight, because standing up would have been inconvenient or uncomfortable. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a blanket. "So tell me," I concluded, looking around the faces that were staring back at me with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to guilty recognition. "What would you do? Would you let them write your story? Or would you take back the pen?" The question hung in the air. And I knew that whatever happened next would determine not just the course of this evening, but the trajectory of my entire relationship with these people who called themselves my family. The silence that followed my question was broken by the sound of a chair scraping against marble. Dylan had stood up at the head table, his face flushed, his movements sharp with what looked like barely controlled panic. "Stella," he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with forced joviality, "I think maybe we should—" "Sit down, Dylan." The command came from Cassandra, and it wasn't a suggestion. Her voice was low, controlled, but it carried the kind of authority that comes from never having been disobeyed. My brother hesitated for a moment, looking between his new wife and his sister, and then slowly sank back into his chair. That single exchange told me everything I needed to know about the power dynamics in my brother's new marriage. But it also told me something else, something that made my blood run cold. "Actually," Cassandra said, rising gracefully from her seat and smoothing down her designer wedding gown, "I think this conversation has gone on long enough." She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. As she walked toward our corner of the ballroom, I could see her father, Harrison Thornfield himself, watching from the head table with calculating eyes. "Stella," Cassandra said, her voice honey-smooth and utterly poisonous, "I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Victoria was simply trying to include you in the festivities, and I'm afraid you've misinterpreted her kindness as something else entirely." The gaslighting was masterful, delivered with such practiced ease that for a moment I almost doubted my own memory of the last 15 minutes. "But since you seem determined to make this evening about yourself, perhaps we should clear the air about a few things." She pulled out her phone, not to take photos, but to reference something she'd already prepared. My stomach dropped as I realized this hadn't been spontaneous cruelty. This had been planned. "You see, when Dylan told me he wanted to invite you to our wedding, I did what any concerned partner would do. I asked a few questions, just to make sure we understood what we were dealing with." She scrolled through her phone with deliberate slowness, letting the tension build. And what I discovered was interesting. For instance, I learned that our dear Stella here hasn't just been working at the Ocean View shipping terminal for the past few years. She's been working there exclusively on the night shift, because that's the only shift they'd give her. She paused, letting that sink in. Apparently, there were some performance issues during her previous day shift assignments, attendance problems, difficulty with supervisory responsibilities, that sort of thing. I felt the blood drain from my face. Someone had been digging into my employment records, but they'd only seen the surface, the carefully constructed cover story that was designed to look exactly like what Cassandra was describing. "But that's not even the most interesting part," Cassandra continued, warming to her theme. "The really fascinating thing is how our Stella here has been presenting herself to the family all these years." She turned to face the crowd, playing to her audience like a seasoned performer. "You see, she's been telling everyone that she's doing important work at the terminal, that she's building a career in maritime operations. But the truth is, she's barely qualified for the position she has." My throat felt tight. The cover story was holding, but barely. If they dug much deeper, If they'd asked the right questions to the right people. In fact, Cassandra said, her smile growing wider, I have it on good authority that Stella's supervisor has been covering for her for months. Apparently, she's been making mistakes that could have cost the company significant money. Equipment damaged, schedules missed, safety protocols ignored.
None of it was true, of course, but it was close enough to the documented fiction of my cover identity that refuting it would require explanations I couldn't give. The only reason she still has the job, Cassandra added with devastating precision, is because her supervisor feels sorry for her. A woman in her late 30s, struggling to keep even a basic supervisory position, no family of her own, no prospects for advancement? I could see the faces around me changing as Cassandra painted her picture. The momentary respect I'd earned by standing up to Victoria was being systematically eroded by this new narrative. So when she stands here tonight and talks about being underestimated, about people not knowing her story, Cassandra said, turning back to face me directly, what she's really talking about is her frustration that reality doesn't match the fantasy she's constructed about herself. The cruelty was breathtaking in its sophistication. Cassandra had taken my own words about being underestimated and turned them into evidence of delusion. Now, I want to be clear, she continued, her voice taking on a tone of reasonable concern. There's nothing wrong with being a night shift supervisor. There's nothing shameful about struggling to advance in your career. What's problematic is standing up in front of a room full of people and pretending that your failures are somehow everyone else's fault. Dylan was staring at his hands now, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear into his chair. He knew this was wrong. I could see it in his posture, in the way he couldn't look at me. But he wasn't going to stop it. The truth is, Stella, Cassandra said, moving closer until she was standing right in front of me, you're exactly what you appear to be. A woman who never quite managed to build the life she wanted, who resents the success of others because it highlights her own shortcomings. She gestured around the elegant ballroom, at the successful guests in their expensive clothes, at the evidence of wealth and achievement that surrounded us. And tonight, instead of graciously celebrating your brother's happiness, you've chosen to make his wedding about your own insecurities and disappointments. The final blow was delivered with surgical precision. I think it would be best if you left. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Around me, I could see faces that had been sympathetic just minutes earlier, now looking uncertain, even embarrassed on my behalf. Cassandra had done something remarkable. She'd taken my moment of strength, my attempt to reclaim my dignity, and transformed it into evidence of everything she claimed was wrong with me. What she didn't know was that I'd just learned something infinitely more valuable than maintaining my cover. I'd learned that this attack wasn't random. It wasn't Victoria's spontaneous cruelty or even Cassandra's protective instincts for her new husband. Someone had been investigating me. Someone had been digging into records they had no business accessing, and someone had been planning to destroy me long before I ever walked into this ballroom. The question was, why? The silence that followed Cassandra's dismissal was deafening. I could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on me, waiting to see if I would comply, if I would gather whatever dignity I had left and slink away into the night like a wounded animal. I was about to respond, though I'm still not sure what I would have said, when a voice cut through the tension like a blade. That's quite enough. The words were spoken quietly, but they carried with unmistakable authority. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the source, the best man, who had been sitting silently at the head table throughout this entire ordeal. Commander William Hayes, though I didn't know his name or rank yet, rose from his chair with the kind of measured precision that comes from decades of military training. He was tall, probably in his mid-50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. They were studying me with an intensity that had nothing to do with casual curiosity. It seems that I've been listening to this conversation with great interest, particularly the part about employment records, background investigations, and accessing information about people's work history. Cassandra's smile faltered slightly. I'm not sure what you're implying. You mean, Commander Hayes. The best man turned toward me and nodded as he walked toward us. He was not only a military officer, but an officer of high rank. Actually, he said, continuing smoothly, I'm stating a fact. Someone has been conducting unauthorized investigations into a United States citizen's employment record. Someone has been accessing classified information without proper clearance or legal authority. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could see Harrison Thornfield at the head table, his face suddenly pale, his eyes fixed on Hayes with something approaching alarm. Classified information? Victoria scoffed, though her voice sounded less certain than it had earlier. She works at a shipping terminal. What could possibly be classified about that? Hayes turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her take an involuntary step backward.
That's an interesting question, he said. What do you think could be classified about maritime operations? About shipping schedules, cargo manifests, security protocols for commercial vessels entering and leaving strategic harbors? He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. Or perhaps about the personnel who oversee those operations, the people who coordinate with federal agencies, who have clearance to access sensitive information about international trade routes and potential security threats? I felt my heart stop. He knew. Somehow, this man I'd never met before tonight knew exactly what the shipping terminal supervisor cover story was hiding. But you know what's really interesting, Hayes continued, his voice growing colder, is that someone was able to access not just personnel records, but detailed performance evaluations, internal communications, and security clearance documentation. That level of access doesn't happen by accident. It requires someone with significant resources, government connections, and a complete disregard for federal law. Cassandra had gone very still. The confident socialite who had been orchestrating my destruction moments earlier was now looking at Hayes with barely concealed panic. I think you're confused about something, she said carefully. I simply made a few phone calls, asked some questions. To whom? Hayes asked sharply. Because maritime security operations fall under the Department of Homeland Security. Personnel records for individuals with security clearances are protected by multiple layers of federal statute. So I'm very curious to know who exactly provided you with information that, by your own description, included detailed performance evaluations and internal supervisory communications. The silence that followed was electric. I could see people throughout the ballroom beginning to understand that this had moved far beyond a family dispute into something much more serious. Unless, of course, Hayes continued, his tone becoming almost conversational, is that Stella Carter's employment at Ocean View Shipping Terminal is exactly what it appears to be. In which case, I have to wonder why you felt the need to investigate her so thoroughly in the first place. He turned to look directly at Harrison Thornfield, who had been watching this exchange with growing horror. Because that level of background investigation, the kind that produces the detailed personal and professional profiles you've been quoting, that's not something you do for a simple family wedding. That's something you do when you're worried about what someone might know, what they might have access to, what threat they might represent. My mind was reeling. Hayes wasn't just defending me, he was systematically dismantling whatever operation Cassandra and her family had been running. But how did he know? How could he possibly understand the implications of what they'd revealed? The question is, Hayes said, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, what exactly are the Thornfields afraid that Stella Carter knows? Harrison Thornfield finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I think you're overstepping your bounds here, Commander. This is a private family celebration, not a military tribunal. You're absolutely right, Hayes replied smoothly. This isn't a military tribunal.
but it might very well become a federal investigation if someone has been illegally accessing classified personnel records for the purpose of harassment and intimidation. He turned back to face the room, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests. Ladies and gentlemen, I think there's something you all should know about the woman who has been standing here tonight, enduring what can only be described as a systematic character assassination. My blood ran cold. He was about to blow my cover completely, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. His name is Stella Carter, Hayes said, his voice carrying with the authority of absolute certainty. And for the past 8 years, she has been serving her country in ways that most of you could never imagine. The silence that followed was profound, electric with anticipation and dread. The question is, Hayes concluded, looking directly at me with something that might have been approval, are you ready to tell them exactly who you really are? The weight of Hayes's question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. 200 faces stared at me, waiting for an answer I wasn't sure I was authorized to give. My cover had been blown, but by someone who clearly understood the implications of what that meant. Commander Hayes, I said carefully, my voice steady despite the chaos in my mind. I think you might be mistaken about Admiral Carter. The words cut through my deflection like a scalpel. Hayes had used my real rank, my real title, the one that existed in classified files buried so deep that even I sometimes forgot it was real. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the kitchen staff had stopped moving. Somewhere in the back of the ballroom, I could hear someone's champagne glass slip from nerveless fingers and shatter on the marble floor. I'm sorry, Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible. Did he just say Admiral? Hayes didn't take his eyes off me. Admiral Stella Marie Carter, United States Navy, currently assigned to the Pentagon's Joint Maritime Intelligence Division, former commanding officer of the USS Leviathan, Medal of Honor recipient for actions during the Strait of Hormuz incident in 2019. Each word hit the room like a physical blow. I could see faces changing, expressions shifting from confusion to shock to something approaching awe. Dylan had gone completely pale, his mouth hanging open as he stared at his sister, the sister he thought he knew. The same Admiral, Hayes continued relentlessly, who has spent the last 3 years coordinating anti-terrorism operations in international waters, who holds the highest security clearance available to naval personnel, who has been living under deep cover in Millbrook Harbor while conducting classified operations that I'm not authorized to discuss in this setting. Cassandra had pressed herself back against the nearest table, her face ashen. I think that's impossible, she breathed. We investigated her. We have documentation.
You have a cover identity, Hayes said, his tone sharp with professional disdain. A carefully constructed fiction designed to hide one of the most decorated naval officers of her generation, while she conducted sensitive national security operations. He reached into his jacket and withdrew what looked like a leather credential case. When he flipped it open, I could see the distinctive seal of Naval Intelligence. Commander William Hayes, Naval Intelligence Service. I've been Admiral Carter's contact officer for the past 2 years, and I've been watching tonight's proceedings with considerable interest. My stomach dropped. Hayes wasn't just defending me, he was my handler, the mysterious contact I'd been reporting to, the voice on encrypted phone calls, the man who had been coordinating my assignments from the shadows. You see, Hayes continued, addressing the room but keeping his eyes on Harrison Thornfield, when someone begins conducting unauthorized investigations into a deep-cover naval officer, that tends to trigger certain protocols. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to something that made his expression darken. For instance, when Harrison Thornfield's private investigation firm began accessing federal databases 3 weeks ago, that created a digital trail that our cybersecurity division has been following with great interest. Harrison Thornfield had gone very, very still. The successful real estate mogul who had been watching his daughter orchestrate my destruction was now looking at Hayes like a trapped animal. The same investigation firm, Hayes added, his voice growing colder, that has contracts with certain foreign entities who have been very interested in disrupting American maritime security operations. The implications of that statement rippled through the room like a shockwave. This wasn't just about family drama anymore. This was about espionage, about foreign intelligence operations, about threats to national security. "That's a serious accusation," Harrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's not an accusation. It's a statement of documented fact. Your firm, Thornfield Strategic Solutions, received a payment of $2.3 million from a shell company linked to Chinese intelligence services. 3 days later, you began investigating Admiral Carter's cover identity." He turned to face Cassandra, who was now visibly shaking. Which raises the question, what exactly were you planning to do with the information you gathered tonight? Because publicly exposing a deep cover naval intelligence officer, whether deliberately or accidentally, is considered an act of treason under federal law. The word treason hit the ballroom like a thunderclap. People began looking around nervously, as if suddenly realizing they had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a family wedding. "Now, wait just a minute." Dylan finally found his voice, standing up from the head table. "This is insane. Stella is my sister. She works at the shipping terminal. She's been struggling with her career for years. Your sister has been protecting this harbor and every person in it from terrorist threats that would keep you awake at night if you knew the details." He gestured toward me with something that looked like respect. "While you've been worried about quarterly earnings reports, Admiral Carter has been preventing attacks on American shipping that could have crippled the East Coast economy. While you've been attending charity galas, she's been coordinating with international allies to disrupt weapons smuggling operations that threaten civilian populations." The room was spinning around me. Years of carefully maintained cover, of pretending to be someone I wasn't, of enduring my family's pity and dismissal, all collapsing in the space of minutes. "But here's what's really interesting," Hayes continued, pulling out another document. "The timing of tonight's attack wasn't random. Admiral Carter was scheduled to conclude her deep cover assignment next week. She was going to resume her regular duties at the Pentagon, which would have meant revealing her true identity to her family." He looked directly at Harrison Thornfield. "Someone didn't want that to happen. Someone wanted to destroy her credibility, her relationships, her psychological stability before she could return to full active duty. And someone was willing to pay a considerable sum to make that happen." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrifying clarity. The investigation into my background, Cassandra's systematic character assassination, the timing of the attack, none of it was coincidental. "So now we have to ask ourselves," Hayes said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Was tonight's humiliation just personal cruelty, or was it something much more dangerous? Was this a family dispute, or was it an enemy operation designed to compromise a high-value intelligence asset?" He closed his phone and looked around the room with the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with threats to national security. "Because if it's the latter, then everyone involved is going to have a very long conversation with some very serious people." The aftermath of Hayes' revelation was chaos barely contained by social convention. Whispered conversations erupted across the ballroom as guests tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Some were pulling out phones, others were edging toward exits, and more than a few were staring at me like I'd just materialized from another dimension. Harrison Thornfield had recovered enough of his composure to attempt damage control. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to controlling narratives. "You can't seriously expect us to believe that Stella—" "What you believe is irrelevant," Hayes cut him off sharply. "What matters is what the evidence shows. And right now, the evidence shows a pattern of foreign-influenced operations targeting a United States naval officer." He looked around the room with the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with threats to national security. "Which means this wedding reception has just become an active crime scene.
The words sent a visible shock through the assembled guests. Victoria had pressed herself against a wall, her phone clutched in her hands like a lifeline. Cassandra was still frozen beside her table, the confident socialite replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd stumbled into. However, Hayes continued, his tone shifting slightly, Admiral Carter and I have been discussing the best way to handle this situation without causing unnecessary panic or compromising ongoing operations. I stared at him. We hadn't been discussing anything, but something in his expression told me to play along, that he had a plan that extended beyond simply exposing the truth. The reality is, Hayes said, pulling out his phone and scrolling to what looked like a text message, we've been expecting something like this to happen. Admiral Carter's cover was always going to be temporary, and we've been preparing for the possibility that hostile actors might attempt to compromise her identity. He showed the phone screen to Harrison Thornfield, whose face went even paler as he read whatever was displayed there. What Mr. Thornfield is looking at, Hayes explained to the room, is a text message I received 17 minutes ago from the Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence. It says, and I quote, "Operation Millbrook Harbor is now active. Proceed with Phase 2 protocols." Operation Millbrook Harbor. I'd never heard the name before, but the way Hayes said it suggested something that had been planned for months, maybe years. You see, Hayes continued, pocketing his phone, we've known for some time that foreign intelligence services were interested in our maritime security operations in this region. We've also known that they were likely to attempt recruitment or compromise of key personnel. He gestured toward me with what looked like professional pride. What we didn't know was exactly how they would make their approach, or who their local assets might be. Tonight has been educational. The implication was staggering. Hayes was suggesting that this entire evening, my humiliation, the exposure of my identity, even the revelation of the Thornfield family's activities had been part of some elaborate counterintelligence operation. So, what happens now? Dylan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, which in a way was exactly accurate. Now, Hayes said, we implement the protocols we've been preparing for this exact scenario. He walked over to where I was standing, and in a gesture that somehow managed to be both respectful and commanding, extended his arm. Admiral Carter, if you would. I understood. Whatever was about to happen, I needed to play my part. I straightened my shoulders, let the posture and bearing of my real rank settle over me like a uniform, and took his arm. The transformation was immediate and visible. The woman who had been enduring humiliation and mockery was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself with the authority of command, someone who looked capable of making decisions that affected national security. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Carter will now be resuming her official duties. The cover identity of Stella Carter, shipping terminal supervisor, is hereby terminated. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the room. However, given the sensitive nature of the intelligence gathered tonight, everyone present is now bound by federal non-disclosure agreements. Any discussion of tonight's events outside this room will be considered a breach of national security. I could see people throughout the ballroom exchanging nervous glances. What had started as a wedding reception had become something out of a spy thriller, and none of them had signed up for this level of complexity. But more importantly, Hayes continued, tax the Thornfield family's cooperation tonight. We have clear evidence of foreign intelligence operations on American soil. His smile was cold, professional, which means we can use that evidence to trace back through their networks, identify their handlers, and potentially disrupt operations that extend far beyond Millbrook Harbor. He looked directly at Harrison Thornfield. You can continue to be part of the problem,
Or you can become part of the solution. But what you cannot do is pretend that tonight never happened. He turned back to address the room. Admiral Carter and I will be conducting interviews with key witnesses over the next several hours. I suggest everyone remain available. Then he leaned closer to me, his voice dropping to a whisper only I could hear. We need to talk. Privately. There are things about tonight that even you don't understand yet. My blood ran cold. Hayes had orchestrated this revelation, manipulated the situation to expose the Thornfield connection, and positioned us to roll up what appeared to be a significant intelligence network. But his warning suggested that the real game was just beginning. One more thing, Hayes announced to the room, his voice resuming its command tone. Admiral Carter's brother, Dylan, and his new wife, Cassandra, will be accompanying us for additional questioning. Given their unique position in tonight's events, their cooperation will be essential to resolving this matter. I looked at Dylan, saw the fear and confusion in his eyes, and realized that my little brother had just become a pawn in an intelligence operation that none of us fully understood. The wedding reception was over, but the real mission was just beginning.
Hayes led me through a maze of service corridors behind the Grandview Ballroom, past stacks of folding chairs and catering equipment, into what appeared to be a private conference room. The contrast was jarring, from crystal chandeliers and marble floors to fluorescent lighting and industrial carpet in the span of 30 seconds. We can speak freely here, Hayes said, pulling out a small electronic device that looked like a cross between a phone and a radar detector. He swept it around the room methodically. Clean, no surveillance. I watched him work, my mind still reeling from the events of the last hour. How long have you been planning this? Which part? Hayes asked, pocketing the device. The exposure of your identity, the trap for the Thornfields, or the complete reconstruction of your life? The way he phrased the question made my stomach drop. What do you mean, reconstruction of my life? Hayes pulled out a chair and gestured for me to sit. When I remained standing, he sighed and sat down himself, suddenly looking older than he had in the ballroom. Stella, Admiral Carter, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, but you need to understand the full scope of what's been happening here. He opened his phone and scrolled to a series of photographs that made no immediate sense to me. Harbor scenes, shipping containers, people I didn't recognize. Your brother Dylan didn't meet Cassandra Thornfield by accident. Their relationship was engineered, orchestrated, a 2-year operation designed to get close to you. The room felt like it was tilting. That's impossible. Dylan works in finance. He's never had anything to do with intelligence, military operations. Dylan works at Meridian Financial. Do you know what Meridian Financial specializes in? I stared at him blankly. Maritime insurance. Specifically, they handle coverage for shipping companies operating in high-risk international waters, companies that transport sensitive cargo, work with government contracts, require security clearances for their personnel. The pieces began clicking into place with horrifying clarity. You're saying Dylan had access. I'm saying Dylan had access to information about every classified shipping operation on the East Coast, insurance claims, security reports, personnel files, cargo manifests, everything that a foreign intelligence service would need to understand and potentially disrupt American maritime operations. He scrolled to another image on his phone. This one showed Dylan at what looked like a business dinner, sitting across from men I didn't recognize. These photos were taken 6 months ago. Your brother having dinner with associates of the same shell company that paid Harrison Thornfield to investigate you. The same dinner where he first mentioned having a sister who worked in maritime operations. My legs felt weak. I finally sat down, hard. Dylan doesn't know. He couldn't know. He's not sophisticated enough for... You're right. Dylan doesn't know. Dylan is what we call an unwitting asset. Someone who provides valuable intelligence without understanding what they are doing or why it matters. Hayes leaned forward, his expression grim.
But Cassandra knew. Cassandra has known from the moment she first approached him at that networking event 18 months ago. She targeted him specifically because of his access to maritime insurance data and his connection to you. The room was spinning. Everything I thought I knew about my brother's relationship, his success, his happiness, was a lie constructed around me. The real question, Hayes continued, is what they were planning to do once they had compromised your identity and your emotional state. Because destroying your cover wasn't the endgame, Stella. It was just the setup. He pulled out another device, this one looking more like a traditional tablet. When he activated it, I could see what appeared to be a map of Millbrook Harbor overlaid with shipping routes and security zones. 3 days from now, a cargo vessel called the Northern Star is scheduled to dock at Terminal 7. It's carrying medical supplies for a refugee relief operation in Southeast Asia. Completely legitimate, fully documented, cleared through all the appropriate channels. He zoomed in on specific sections of the map. What the manifest doesn't show is that the Northern Star is also carrying $12 million in unmarked currency, payment for weapons that will be diverted from the relief supplies and sold to insurgent groups. My blood ran cold. How do you know this? Because we've been tracking this operation for 8 months. The Northern Star is the final link in a weapons trafficking network that stretches from American defense contractors through European shell companies to terrorist organizations in 3 different countries. He looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. And there's more, Hayes said, his voice dropping even lower. The Northern Star isn't just carrying weapons and money, it's carrying something else. Something that makes this entire operation a direct threat to national security. He scrolled to a new section of intelligence files, these marked with classification levels I recognized as being far above even my clearance. Biological samples, specifically engineered pathogens that could be weaponized for terrorist attacks on civilian populations. The kind of weapons that could kill thousands of people and be virtually untraceable back to their source. My mouth dried. Where did you get this intelligence?
From sources we can't discuss in this setting, Hayes said. But what matters is that we now have 48 hours to intercept that shipment without alerting the network to our knowledge of their operations. He closed the tablet and looked at me directly, which brings us to why tonight's events were so carefully orchestrated. We needed to flush out the local assets, identify the payment mechanisms, and create a situation where we could act against the Northern Star operation without compromising our ongoing intelligence gathering. I stared at him, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. You used my family's wedding. You used my humiliation, my pain, my brother's marriage? I used an opportunity that presented itself, Hayes said firmly, and I used it to prevent what could have been a catastrophic attack on American civilians. He stood up, his posture shifting back into command mode. But now we need your decision, Admiral Carter, because stopping the Northern Star is going to require someone to go aboard that vessel, identify and secure the biological weapons, and coordinate their safe removal without alerting the trafficking network. The weight of what he was asking settled over me like lead. You want me to infiltrate a weapons trafficking operation? Alone? Using my blown cover identity as leverage? I want you to do your job, Hayes said simply. The job you've been training for, the job you've been positioned to do, the job that only you can accomplish. He moved toward the door, then paused. But first, we need to deal with your family, because Dylan and Cassandra are going to be essential to making this work. My brother, who had never wanted anything more complicated than a successful marriage and a comfortable life, was about to become a key asset in a counterintelligence operation that could determine the fate of thousands of innocent people. Welcome back to active duty, Admiral Carter. The mission begins now. When we returned to the ballroom, the scene had transformed into something resembling a cross between a crime scene investigation and a very exclusive briefing room. Hayes had somehow managed to clear out most of the wedding guests,
I could see them being escorted through side exits by men and women in dark suits who had appeared from nowhere, while the key players remained seated at tables that had been rearranged into a more functional configuration. Dylan sat pale and rigid beside Cassandra, who looked like she was calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Harrison Thornfield occupied a chair that might as well have been in the defendant's dock, flanked by two federal agents who weren't bothering to be subtle about their presence. Victoria had been relegated to a corner table, her phone confiscated, her earlier confidence replaced with barely controlled panic. "Thank you all for your patience," Hayes announced, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to running briefings that determined life-and-death outcomes. "We're going to need your full cooperation for the next phase of this operation." He gestured to the agents, who immediately began distributing what looked like standard government forms. First, everyone will be signing comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. These are not suggestions. Violation of these agreements carries a minimum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. I watched my brother's face as he processed this information. The successful finance executive who had been planning his honeymoon was now being briefed on matters of national security by people who could make him disappear if they chose to. Second, Hayes continued, we're going to need specific assistance from each of you to ensure the success of an operation that will prevent significant loss of American lives. He pulled up the harbor map on a larger screen that had been wheeled in during our private conversation. At 0600 hours on Wednesday, the cargo vessel Northern Star will begin docking procedures at Terminal 7. Admiral Carter will be aboard that vessel conducting what will appear to be a routine security inspection. Cassandra finally found her voice. "You can't be serious. You expect us to just—" "I expect you to choose between cooperation and prosecution," Hayes cut her off sharply. "Your family has accepted payment from foreign intelligence services to compromise a United States naval officer. The evidence is overwhelming, the charges are serious, and the consequences are permanent." He let that sink in before continuing. "However, if you cooperate fully with this operation, certain accommodations might be possible regarding the charges you're facing." Harrison Thornfield leaned forward. "What kind of accommodations?" "The kind that keep you out of federal prison," Hayes replied without hesitation, "but only if your assistance is complete, immediate, and effective." I could see the calculation happening in Thornfield's eyes. Successful businessmen were accustomed to negotiating deals, even when the stakes were higher than usual. "What exactly do you need from us?" he asked. He activated another section of his tablet, displaying what looked like detailed personnel files. "The Northern Star has been cleared for docking by Harbor Authority personnel, who are currently under the influence of the same network that recruited your family. Admiral Carter cannot simply appear on that vessel without triggering security protocols that would alert the trafficking operation." He looked directly at Dylan, "which is where your access to maritime insurance databases becomes essential." My brother stared at him blankly. "I don't understand." "Every vessel entering Millbrook Harbor requires updated insurance verification before docking," Hayes explained patiently. "That verification process requires communication between the Harbor Authority, the shipping company, and the insurance provider. During that communication, discrepancies can be discovered that require immediate investigation." The plan was becoming clear, and it was elegant in its simplicity. "You're going to create a discrepancy," I said, understanding. "Something that requires immediate inspection that bypasses normal protocols."
Precisely, Hayes confirmed. Dylan will file an insurance flag that suggests potential liability issues with the Northern Star's cargo manifest. That flag will trigger an emergency inspection requirement that can only be satisfied by a senior maritime security officer. He gestured toward me. Admiral Carter, operating under her cover identity as a harbor security supervisor, will board the vessel to conduct the inspection. Once aboard, she'll have legal authority to examine any cargo that might represent an insurance liability. Cassandra was shaking her head. "This is insane. You're asking us to commit fraud, to falsify official documents." I'm asking you to prevent the distribution of biological weapons to terrorist organizations, Hayes said, his voice cold as winter steel. But if you prefer to focus on the paperwork technicalities, we can certainly discuss those during your arraignment. Dillon finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens if something goes wrong, if they figure out what we're doing? Hayes's expression softened slightly. That's why Admiral Carter will be going aboard alone. If the operation is compromised, if there's violence, if anything goes wrong, the responsibility and the risk remain with trained personnel. He looked around the table at each face in turn. But I need you to understand something. This isn't a theoretical exercise. The biological agents aboard the Northern Star are designed to be dispersed in urban environments, subway systems, office buildings, shopping centers. The casualty estimates run into the tens of thousands. The silence that followed was profound. Even Victoria had stopped fidgeting, the magnitude of what Hayes was describing finally breaking through her self-absorption. So, let's discuss the specifics, Hayes continued, pulling out detailed operational notes. Dillon, you'll need to access the Meridian financial system tomorrow morning and create an insurance discrepancy report for the Northern Star. The timing is critical. It needs to be filed no earlier than 1800 hours Tuesday, no later than 2200 hours. He handed Dillon a sheet of paper covered with technical specifications. These are the exact parameters for the discrepancy. Deviation from these specifications could compromise the entire operation. Dillon took the paper with hands that were visibly shaking. How do you know all this? How do you know so much about insurance protocols, database systems? Because this operation has been in planning for 6 months. We've been tracking the Northern Star, we've been monitoring the trafficking network, and we've been preparing for exactly the scenario. He turned to Cassandra. Your role is equally important. The Northern Star's crew will be expecting normal social interactions during their shore leave. You're going to provide those interactions. Cassandra's face went pale. What does that mean? It means you're going to attend the reception that Harrison's real estate company is hosting for the Northern Star's officers tomorrow night. You're going to be charming, social, completely normal, and you're going to ensure that they have no reason to suspect that anything unusual is planned for the following morning. Hayes looked at his watch. We have 18 hours to finalize the details, brief all participants, and position assets. After that, Admiral Carter boards the Northern Star, and we either succeed in preventing a terrorist attack or we deal with the consequences of failure. He stood up, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Questions? The silence stretched until Dillon finally raised his hand like a student in a classroom. What happens to us afterward? I mean, assuming this works. Hayes smiled, but it wasn't a comforting expression. Afterward, Mr. Carter, you go back to your normal life with the knowledge that you helped save thousands of innocent people, and with the understanding that this conversation never happened. He paused, looking around the table one final time. Unless, of course, it doesn't work, in which case none of our futures are going to be particularly relevant. The Northern Star looked innocuous enough in the gray dawn light of Wednesday morning, just another cargo vessel among dozens in Millbrook Harbor, her hull streaked with rust and salt, containers stacked like metal building blocks across her deck. Nothing about her suggested that she carried enough weaponized biological agents to kill half the population of the eastern seaboard. I stood on the dock at 0545 hours, wearing the same Maritime Authority uniform I'd worn dozens of times during my cover assignment, carrying the same cargo inspection clipboard and digital scanner I'd used for routine cargo checks. The only difference was the ceramic body armor hidden beneath my jacket and the ceramic knife strapped to my ankle. Metal detectors were standard on vessels like the Northern Star, but ceramic weapons were invisible to their sensors. Hayes's voice crackled through the nearly invisible earpiece I wore. Admiral, you are cleared for boarding. Shore team is in position. Extraction assets are standing by. I walked up the gangway with the measured pace of someone conducting routine business, nodding to the crew members who watched me with the kind of polite attention that cargo ships always showed to harbor inspectors. Just another bureaucrat with a clipboard, another delay in their schedule, another box to check before they could complete their business and move on to the next port. The ship's first officer, a weathered man in his 50s named Kozlov, met me at the top of the gangway. He said, "Ms. Carter, we received notification about insurance inspection.
is unexpected, but we cooperate fully.
I appreciate that, Mr. Kozlov, I replied, keeping my voice level and professional. This should be routine. Just need to verify some discrepancies in the cargo manifest that might affect liability coverage. As we walked across the deck toward the main cargo holds, I activated the scanner Hayes had given me, a device that looked exactly like standard maritime inspection equipment, but was actually detecting trace chemical signatures that would indicate the presence of biological weapons. The first two cargo holds contained exactly what their manifests claimed: medical supplies, water purification equipment, and emergency shelter materials destined for refugee camps in Southeast Asia. The scanner remained silent as I moved through the containers, checking serial numbers and conducting the kind of thorough but unremarkable inspection that any competent harbor official would perform. But when we reached the third cargo hold, deep in the ship's belly, the scanner began emitting the subtle vibrations that indicated positive detection. This section contains pharmaceutical supplies, Kozlov explained as we descended into the hold's artificial lighting. Very valuable cargo, requires special temperature controls. I nodded, making notes on my clipboard, while the scanner continued its silent alert. Somewhere among the legitimate medical supplies were containers holding engineered pathogens that could be dispersed as aerosol weapons in crowded urban environments. I'll need to spot check some of these pharmaceutical containers, I said, keeping my voice casual. Insurance company is particularly concerned about temperature-sensitive cargo. Kozlov's expression didn't change, but I caught him making eye contact with another crew member who had appeared at the hold's entrance. Something about that exchange made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Of course, Kozlov said smoothly, though I should mention, some of these containers have tamper-evident seals that are very expensive to replace if broken unnecessarily. The warning was clear. Don't dig too deep. But the scanner was now vibrating so intensely that I could feel it through my pocket. Whatever I was looking for was close. I moved toward a cluster of containers marked with pharmaceutical company logos, their surfaces covered with the kind of official documentation that would satisfy most inspections. But the scanner's intensity increased as I approached a specific container marked antibiotics, refrigerated, do not open. This one, I said, pointing to the container. I need to verify the internal temperature readings. Kozlov stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath. Mr. Carter, I must advise that opening sealed pharmaceutical containers without proper authorization could create legal problems for both Harbor Authority and my company. I looked up at him, letting a bit of Admiral Carter show through the facade of Harbor Inspector. Mr. Kozlov, I have full legal authority to inspect any cargo that might represent an insurance liability. Are you refusing to comply with a federal inspection order? The tension in the hold was suddenly electric. The crew member at the entrance had been joined by two others, and all three were positioned in ways that blocked my exit routes. This was no longer a routine inspection. Perhaps we should contact Harbor Authority Supervisor to confirm inspection requirements, Kozlov said carefully. I am the supervisor on duty, and I'm ordering you to open that container. The transformation was instantaneous. Kozlov's hand went to his waistband, while the crew members at the entrance moved to flank me, but years of combat training and operational experience gave me advantages they hadn't anticipated. I was already moving as Kozlov drew his weapon, the ceramic blade finding the gap between his ribs before he could bring his gun to bear. The other crew members reached for their weapons, but the narrow confines of the cargo hold worked in my favor. They couldn't get clear shots without risking hitting each other. Hayes's voice crackled in my earpiece as I dove behind a container stack. Admiral, we're reading elevated stress indicators. Status report. Cover blown. Multiple hostiles, weapons drawn, continuing mission. The firefight that followed was brief but intense.
Ceramic knife against 3 armed opponents in a space the size of a shipping container with biological weapons somewhere in the immediate vicinity. Every shot risked puncturing containers that might release pathogens into the air. But training and desperation are powerful motivators. Within 90 seconds, the 3 crew members were down, and I was standing over the container that had triggered the scanner's alerts. The lock was complex. Not just a standard shipping seal, but a sophisticated electronic system that required both a physical key and a digital code. But Hayes had prepared for this possibility. Scanner mode 7, his voice guided me through the earpiece, pointed at the lock mechanism. The device in my hand shifted configuration, becoming something that looked more like a sophisticated electronics tool than maritime inspection equipment. Within 30 seconds, the lock clicked open. Inside the container, beneath layers of legitimate pharmaceutical packaging, I found them. 12 sealed vials containing what looked like ordinary clear liquid, but which the scanner indicated were engineered biological agents capable of surviving aerosol dispersion and remaining active in urban environments for weeks. Package located, I reported quietly. 12 units, sealed, secured. Outstanding, Admiral. Extraction team is moving to your position. ETA, 3 minutes. But as I carefully secured the vials in the protective case Hayes had provided, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps on the metal stairs leading down to the cargo hold. Heavy footsteps. Multiple people.
More crew members were coming, and they would be expecting their colleagues to be alive and in control of the situation. Hayes, I whispered urgently, I need those extraction assets now. 2 minutes out, Admiral. Can you hold position? I looked around the cargo hold. 3 bodies, scattered weapons, and a case full of biological weapons that could kill thousands of people if mishandled. I'll make it work, I replied, chambering a round in the pistol I'd taken from Kozlov. The footsteps were getting closer, and voices were calling out in what sounded like Russian. Whatever happened in the next 2 minutes would determine whether this mission ended in success or catastrophe. Admiral Stella Carter, who had spent 2 years pretending to be a failed harbor supervisor, was about to show these people exactly what a decorated naval officer could accomplish when the stakes were high enough. The extraction didn't come from where I expected it. Instead of Hayes' team storming down the cargo hold stairs, the wall of the ship's hull suddenly exploded inward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Through the smoking breach stepped 6 figures in full tactical gear, moving with the synchronized precision of a special operations team. Admiral Carter, the lead operator called out, his voice filtered through a tactical mask. We're here to get you home. The Russian voices above us had turned to shouting, then to gunfire. Hayes' shore team was engaging the remaining crew members on deck while the extraction team secured the cargo hold. Within 30 seconds, the container with the biological weapons was sealed in a containment unit and being passed through the breach in the hull to a waiting assault boat. Secondary package? The lead operator asked, gesturing to the bodies of the crew members I'd taken down. Intelligence value, I confirmed. Kozlov was running the operation. His phone and personal effects might lead to the rest of the network. As we prepared to exit through the impromptu escape route, I could hear Hayes' voice over the team's communication system coordinating what sounded like a major law enforcement operation. Harbor police, federal agents, Coast Guard cutters. The Northern Star was being surrounded and secured by enough firepower to stop a small war. The assault boat ride to shore took less than 5 minutes, but it gave me time to process what had just happened. 2 years of living a lie, of enduring my family's pity and dismissal, of pretending to be someone I wasn't, had led to this moment. The biological weapons were secure, the trafficking network was exposed, and the threat to American civilians had been neutralized. But as I approached the dock where Hayes was waiting, I realized that the hardest part was still ahead of me. Explaining to my family who I really was, what I'd really been doing, why I'd let them believe I was a failure when I was actually preventing international terrorism.
My phone buzzed with a text message from Dylan. "Can we talk? There's a lot I need to understand." I found him waiting in the parking lot of our childhood restaurant, the little diner where we'd gone for pancakes every Sunday morning when we were kids. He looked older than he had 3 days ago, like the weight of what he'd been involved in had aged him in real time. "So," he said, as I slid into the booth across from him, "my sister is a Navy admiral who prevents terrorist attacks for a living." "Among other things," I confirmed. Dylan was quiet for a long moment, staring at his coffee cup. "Why didn't you tell me? Why let me think you were struggling, that you'd never found your path?" "Because the mission required it," I said simply. "And because sometimes protecting the people you love means letting them think less of you than they should."
He looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not pity, not disappointment, but something that looked like awe. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "I mean, I was always proud of you, even when I thought... But now I understand. What you've been doing, what you've been sacrificing, it's my job, Dylan." "No," he said firmly. "It's your calling, and I'm sorry I never saw it." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two siblings trying to understand each other across a gap that had never really existed except in our own assumptions. "What happens now?" Dylan asked eventually. "Do you go back to the Pentagon, back to your regular duties?" I thought about Hayes's final briefing, about the new assignment waiting for me, about the choice I'd been given between returning to my previous life and taking on something even more challenging. "There's a position opening up," I said. "Director of Maritime Intelligence Operations for the entire Eastern Seaboard. It would mean staying here in Millbrook Harbor, working openly instead of undercover." Dylan's eyes widened. "You'd be running the operation you've been part of?" "I'd be running all the operations. Every port from Maine to Georgia, every security threat, every intelligence concern related to maritime activities in American waters." I smiled at the thought. "And it would mean no more pretending to be someone I'm not." "That sounds perfect," Dylan said. "But what about family dinners? What about normal sibling relationships? What about just being my sister instead of Admiral Carter?" I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Dylan, I've always just been your sister. Everything else is just details." As I drove home that evening to my modest apartment on Harbor Street, the same apartment I'd been living in for 2 years, but which somehow felt completely different now, I thought about the call I needed to make to Hayes. The call where I would accept the promotion, take on the responsibility, and stop living in the shadows. But first, I had another call to make. Victoria Ashworth answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Stella?" "Admiral Carter," I corrected gently, "and I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" "For showing me exactly who my real family is, for making it clear who deserves my trust and who doesn't, for helping me understand that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who smile while they're destroying you." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. "Victoria, you have 48 hours to resign from your law firm and leave Millbrook Harbor. If you're still here after that, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation." I hung up and deleted her number from my phone. Some bridges are meant to be burned. If you've ever had to hide who you really are to protect the people and the mission you believe in, if you've ever endured being underestimated because the truth was too dangerous to reveal, drop a "truth always wins" in the comments. Because sometimes the greatest strength is letting others think you're weak, until the moment comes when showing your true power can save lives. Your mission matters, your sacrifice matters, and your truth, when the time is right to reveal it, will change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.